All right, so just to get a little more of an idea of what I was starting to understand about my grandpa's teachings was like at the time when my grandpa was like he didn't like TD Jakes. I did, he didn't explain things well, so I didn't understand that it was because TD Jakes talked about suffering, and you know my grandpa thought that suffering was self-confirmatory and you don't have to suffer. So it took a while for me to figure that out after studying Dr. Horace's books and existential metapsychiatry and stuff. But like I kind of got that idea when I was reading Dr. Horace's books recently more, when Dr. Horace was talking about like, yes, disease comes from existentially invalid thoughts. And like, you create your reality, you create your suffering in a way. And, my grandpa would probably tone it down a little bit and be like, well, you choose to experience the suffering or not. You don't have to experience it. Like you can be sick, but you don't have to experience it. Or my grandpa would say everything is energy. So like, yes, if you get sick, it's because a lot of times it's because you're not in the flow and stuff like that. But regardless, my grandpa liked Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's idea was like, that Christianity and Judaism and these religions just in general tended to extol the poor and like look highly upon the poor. And Nietzsche argued that is because, that was a way for the poor and the weak to feel power and to get power over the nobility and the strong. But my grandpa didn't, my grandpa thought that Nietzsche also believed this too, but my grandpa thought that really Jesus wasn't about that. That Jesus was about like, about the flow, about transcending the ego. And like I said, my grandpa would, I would be like, well, what about when Jesus said, blessed are the poor? But, then I kind of got that idea that my grandpa was saying, for they will be like healed or something. But but the idea was like, yes, blessed are they, because if you're in the flow, if you're with Jesus or whatever, then you will not be poor. So it's kind of like I thought it was a victim blaming thing. Like if you're not in the flow, you wouldn't be poor. Or my grandpa would be like, yeah, well, just because you're poor doesn't mean that you're like, high and like exalted or whatever. And like another example was, Judas, Judas like dumps perfume on Jesus's feet, and my grandpa was like, and then Jesus, and then a woman pours a perfume on Jesus's feet, and then Judas was like, you could have given that to the poor, but Jesus was like, you will always have the poor, but not you won't always have me. My grandpa was like, yes, Jesus isn't talking about like the poor, like give to the poor. That's the social welfare gospel. That's the idea like I can save myself if I give to the poor. But my grandpa's like, no, Jesus is talking about the flow and transcending the ego to inquiry and all that. So my grandpa, but when I was a leftist communist anti-white person, I wanted to exalt the poor and be like, yes, the poor are the greatest. The least is the greatest. But my grandpa would be like, no, it's not talking about the poor. That when Jesus said the least is the greatest, he's talking about the, if you're humble. And my grandpa would be like, yes, just go all out and be humble. And like my grandpa would be like, probably Kanye West isn't humble. He's like, I'm the greatest and stuff. But if you're humble, you're not focused on the self, but you're just focused on excelling. Just another example of that would be like, Paul in the Bible says, be content. And I asked my grandpa, I was like, grandpa, Paul says be content. So what does that mean? But my grandpa's like, he's not saying like be content and just like settle and just relax. He's saying, don't try to make things happen. But my grandpa would be like, but, still go all out. And, go all out like Ayn Rand says, right? My grandpa's like an Ayn Rand and Nietzsche fan. Like, go all out and, and work hard and, be in the flow. And, like, I remember one time I was watching a motivational speaker. It was a black guy. And he's like, yeah, guys, you got to just go all out and da-da-da. And I was like, what do you think about him, Grandpa? My grandpa was like, well, he's expressing the ego. Like, the way he's talking, it's like, it's very self-confirmatory. But my grandpa was saying, but, the idea, he seems to be trying to, like, tell people to make things happen. But my grandpa's like, in the flow, you don't try to make things happen. You transcend the self and you're one with everything, right? But my grandpa would be like, but, trying to make things happen and going all out, that can get you in the flow. And that was one of my grandpa's quotes, like, you cannot get there from here, but only he who refuses to accept that will understand that there is here. My grandpa's like, yes, you can't get, the self can't transcend the self. You can't get in the flow. The self can't get in the flow. But if you try to make things happen, well, maybe you can lose yourself and get in the flow. Like my grandpa was saying, like Albert Einstein said, that that sometimes you have to exhaust all resources, and then the answer will tap and then perhaps while eating an apple, the answer will tap you on the shoulder and say, "Here I am." And my grandpa's like, yes, that's the idea that you go all out and you study and you do your research and inquiry. And then when you least expect it, when you let go, when you eat the apple and then you let go and then there's inspiration, it's no longer the ego and rational thinking, but you get the inspiration, then the answer comes to you, and that's inspired thought. And that's what my grandpa would say is the flow, right? So this is kind of what my grandpa was teaching, and I kind of get that. I kind of understand it. But like I said, at this time, I understand that now, but at that time I was still a little confused. And I was just thinking, my grandpa's a Nietzsche fan. He thinks that Jesus was basically Nietzsche. And I was like, but dude, my grandpa's a Nazi. I was like, my grandpa is basically a Nazi. He believes the same thing the Nazis did. Nazis were a fan of Nietzsche. Hitler was a fan of Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's whole thing was like, the slave mentality of the Jews and, of religious people, they think that being poor and being weak is superior. But he's like, no, being weak and being poor is not superior. Like that's the mongrel idea, And when I was a leftist communist, I hated Nazis, and I didn't like that idea of Nietzsche, and I wanted to think, no, the poor, the people who suffer, the black people, the Jews, they're actually the good ones. They're and it's the white people who make them suffer, and I wanted to blame the white person and stuff, and be like, yeah, no, the people who suffer, the people who are left out, the people who are persecuted, they're the greatest. And I wanted to see myself as persecuted, and I felt that I was with my family because the shoot away machine and all that. But my grandpa's whole thing was no, he believed more in Nietzsche, and this is what Dr. Hora taught. Dr. Hora kind of taught if you suffer, it's because you're existentially invalid thoughts, and don't blame people. You bring about your own suffering in a lot of ways. But my grandpa would be like, yes. So Dr. Hora would say and nothing comes into your experience uninvited. And, and my grandpa's thing was yeah, and a lot of people get pleasure from suffering. They think oh, we're superior because we suffer. And that's self-confirmatory. But my grandpa would be like, the self is an illusion. And you want to transcend the self, and being oh, I'm suffering, so I'm going to go to heaven. Or, oh, I'm giving to the poor, so I'm going to go to heaven. That's still focusing on trying to protect and promote and preserve the self. But my grandpa would be like, there is no self. Everything is one, and there is no thing. And these people are still stuck in the self. But I was like, yeah, my grandpa's just a white supremacist Nazi. I was like, he's a fan of Nietzsche, and he's a fan of Ayn Rand, who Ayn Rand was basically anti-communism. And when I was a leftist communist, I was anti-white, and I didn't like Ayn Rand because I'm like, she's anti-white. I mean, she's anti-communist. And she's all about yeah, just work hard and don't give to the poor because, then you're not rewarding the people who work hard. And my grandpa would kind of have some agreements to criticisms of Ayn Rand, in that he would be like, yeah, well, maybe she was a little bit egocentric. But my grandpa would be like, yes, but, working hard and going all out, that's good. And my grandpa would be like, and giving to the poor, I asked my grandpa one time, I was like, Grandpa, but what about giving to the poor because you have compassion for the person? You see, and my grandpa's like, yes, there could be a sense of oneness. Everything is one. There is no person, there is no separate person, but everything is one. It's all one body. It's all, all the cells in this body are Ryan. They're all one, but they're different, right? So my grandpa would be like, yes, you can have compassion for somebody. But he would say, but giving to the person isn't necessarily going to help the person. It could actually hurt the person. And that's what my grandpa would say is the difference between being a good person and being what my grandpa would say is a beneficial presence. Because my grandpa would say there is no person. The idea that there's separate persons is an illusion. So he would say be a beneficial presence, and that's when you get inspired thoughts and inspiration, and you're in the flow, and you're not trying to give to people so you can go to heaven to please God, because that's still focused on the illusion of a separate self. Or you're not trying to give to the person because you think it's the right thing to do. But again, my grandpa would say that's calculative thinking. That's rational thinking. And the good I would, I do not. And that which I would not, I end up doing. That's what Paul said. So my grandpa would say, you're trying to do good by giving to the poor, but you actually end up hurting the poor. And you hurt yourself, and you end up causing more problems. So my grandpa would be like, there is no formula, but sometimes giving to the poor can be beneficial. But, then my mom would be like, yeah, don't give to the poor, or don't give to Ryan. But my grandpa would be like, well, my mom's not in the flow. She's being judgmental and she's not in the flow. She's not in oneness consciousness. Like when my mom was making fun of my uncle, like and say calling him gay and like calling him names and stuff. My grandpa's like, yeah, my grandpa didn't like my mom. He told me that. He told me he thought she was very judgmental. She was judgmental consciousness and stuff. But regardless, I'm trying to like kind of explain what my grandpa's teachings were. But like I said, at this time, I felt that my grandpa was mistreating me and he didn't understand the quadrant model. And I thought that he didn't understand reality. And I'm like, dude. And I was thinking he's a Nazi. He's just basically a Nazi. He's an Ayn Rand fan, Nietzsche fan, against giving to the poor. But then at the same time, I was confused because he's talking about like, well, transcend dualistic software. So I'm like, okay, well, you're against giving to the poor and stuff, but transcending dualistic software, he didn't really teach me yet what that meant. That means going into the flow. But I was asking him, I was like, well, for a while I became kind of a white supremacist, and I was, and I was like, was I in the flow? And he's like, no, because you're still focused on protecting and preserving and promoting the self, which is an illusion. So I'm like, okay, so well then transcending dualistic software would include wanting race mixing. That's what I thought. But now I realize that also would be dualistic software because I was going back into my default Jewish mode of wanting race mixing so I can defeat the white people. So that was still dualistic software. And I still was focused on protecting and promoting and preserving the self. So but again, my grandpa would say there is no formula in the flow. Everything is one, right? Another thing that my grandpa taught me that was confusing was I asked my grandpa, well, what about empathy? Like have empathy for people. And my grandpa would be like, no, don't have empathy. And I was like, what? He's like, because empathy is based off feelings, and feelings are illusions because they're based around the body and around the ego. Your feelings are shaped by your ego and the self, but the self is an illusion. So I'm like, huh? But I was like, but he's like, but you can have compassion, and compassion is based on oneness consciousness. But empathy is based around feelings, and feelings are illusory. And they're based around the ego, and like you have empathy for someone, and you might not help the person because of your empathy. Like, okay, you give to the poor because of empathy, but you might actually hurt them, right? So I'm like, okay, so I'm trying to grasp my grandpa's teachings, and I started getting it. But again, at this point, now I understand it more, because now I understand, okay, when you're in the flow, you see things as they really are, and that's based around transcending the self. But at this time, I was still confused. Like, well, what do you mean by transcend dualistic software? Does that mean you want race mixing? Does that mean you want no borders? Like, and that's what I thought. So I was just confused. I'm like, what are you talking about? But now I have a better idea. But at that time, I was just confused, and I was just like, I'm thinking my grandpa's just a Nazi, He's into Nietzsche like the Nazis were. He's into Ayn Rand like the Nazis were. Or Ayn Rand came after the Nazis, but Ayn Rand was kind of against the communists. And when I was a leftist, I was a communist. So I was just like, that's kind of to give an idea of what my grandpa's teachings were. And this is another interesting one. Actually, I'll probably talk about this in the next talk. So in the next talk, I'll go more into a little bit more details about kind of what my grandpa was teaching and kind of what happened next in the story around 2022.